What profound, wonderful stories I've heard tonight, and so I know I'm supposed to just start speaking and telling you something as if I never heard what came before me, but unfortunately I did. So now I have to speak to that. Write what you know. I'm going to change my story tonight and tell you the story of the last 6 years of my life, and the idea of one simple rule, which to me is an oxymoron because there is no rule that is simple. And all rules are sort of meant to be broken, right? I think so. 6 years ago, the actress Brittany Murphy died of potentially a drug overdose that was perhaps self-inflicted. Nobody really knows. It's sort of still considered an unknown avenue and story. I was in Los Angeles in my house in Venice Beach, where I was born and raised, and I was sitting at my living room table when I read that. And you know, over the years, I had always heard about various actors and celebrities dying in my industry, and it never really was very impactful to me. And for some reason, when I heard this, it sent this charge through my blood, and I became more than just fascinated with the way in which she died, which, again, is still considered to this day to be sort of unknown. Brittany moved from Florida when she was very young and was very dedicated to the idea of acting. Moved to Los Angeles with her mother and sought out very specifically to become famous, and she talked about it candidly in interviews. I was born in Los Angeles, and I started acting at the age of 11 years old, accidentally. I was in a school play doing Pippi Longstockings when an agent literally discovered me and said, we should send her on some auditions. And the first audition that I ever did was for General Hospital. It was what they call a cattle call, which is an open audition. Anybody can come to it. And it was hundreds of girls that came, and it came down to between me and one other girl. And I read a poem for my audition, and that's what ultimately got me the part, and I was on that show for 7 years. I had a very different entrance into the world of acting than Brittany did. But I remember that there were all these covers printed about her death, these beautiful photos of her wearing these, long gowns, or, her airbrushed face, talking about how she was gone too soon. And, I studied her autopsy, I studied her life, I studied everything about her, and she actually died in the shower, sort of crumpled over her own body, and I thought, wow, what a powerful juxtaposition in a world and an industry that treats people like objects and is such a standard for voyeurism in a negative way. And from that point on, I wrote a poem for her, and then began sort of writing poems and studying the lives and deaths of other actresses her age, basically any woman under the age of 40. I studied Jane Mansfield, Marilyn Monroe, Sharon Tate, Dominic Dunn, Data Plano, Peg Entwistle, you name it. You name it, I know how they died, I know where they died, I know where they're buried, I know about their lives. This journey took 6 years. The writing of the book took 6 years in totality. And during that 6 years, I found my obsession with their lives and who they were, and their legacy, or their lack thereof, was overtaking me and overtaking my life. And during that time, a lot of the studying of, especially the women that came out of the 1920s when Seconal was a huge drug back then, I thought, wow, wouldn't it be great if I could get my hands on some drugs like that? Some Seconal. Has anybody got any Seconal here today? Anybody? Okay. I never got my hands on Seconal. I don't even know if that really exists anymore. But I did experiment with every possible drug that I could find, specifically the ones that numbed, that made you feel nothing. And when you've grown up in a business where empathy is your job, where interpreting the emotional inner lives of people is your living, what a concept it was to feel nothing. What a wonderful escape it was to cease. I explored this avenue when I was writing a lot of the poems as if I was living their dead lives. And every time I found a similarity between their inability to figure out how they were more than just auditioning actresses, and my inability to see myself as ceased, the more I got closer and closer to this idea and this love of the concept of death. And once I realized that I was really in love with death, I started to get scared. And this was about the 3 years in writing this book, I started to question whether I was suicidal or not. I didn't know. I couldn't tell. It was very hard studying my peers, women who had come before me, women that will come after me, who had died very young and had no sense of who they were. It was hard to do that. This was also, I'm 31 now, this was around my mid-20s. And I was identifying a lot of that pain. And so I was questioning it. And in studying them, I took this year break. I remember I had, the last poem that I wrote before I took the break was for Dana Plato. And for those of you that don't know her, she was on Different Strokes. And Dana got pregnant out of wedlock and was actually fired from Different Strokes. And she became sober for a little while. She was an alcoholic. She had a lot of drug issues. And she got sober, and she went on Howard Stern's radio program. And when she was on there, people called in, as they do on his show. And they didn't say things to her like, "You're ugly, you suck," nothing of that nature. They said things that I would never say to my worst enemy. They said to her, "You don't matter. You have never mattered. You were never good. You should kill yourself." And she starts sobbing in the radio interview. And Howard, in his defense, starts trying to stop them. I mean, that's saying a lot for Howard Stern. He's actually trying to stop his callers from saying these things to her. The next day, Dana died of a drug overdose suicide in her mother's RV. It was Mother's Day. 25 years later, to the day, her son died of a drug overdose. It was Mother's Day. It was such a tragic, painful story, this idea that this woman felt like she had no control over her future or her story or her life. And it was the moment in which I had to stop from writing these pieces and stop from my connection with these women, and had to take a serious step back from all of the drinking and the drugs that I had done during this time, and try to figure out what it was deeply inside of me that I was trying to find with this obsession. Because it wasn't suicide, but death was involved, and I couldn't figure out the death aspect of it. And then I remember I read very randomly this Zadie Smith essay where she talks about being locked out of her house and being stuck in a lobby and looking at this, picking up an art book and seeing this drawing of a very masculine man carrying a very wilted dead body over his shoulder. And she spirals down into the ideas of grief and death and longing and rebirth. And it occurred to me that the women that I had been studying and the pain that I had been feeling was absolutely a death, and had been a death for a very long time. And I had done myself the great disservice of not embracing it, of not telling myself that I was prepared to die, that a piece of me, the piece of me that grew up from a very young age in front of television, that had no control over her outcome, that knew nothing other than poetry, which is wonderful, but auditioning, and knowing how to impress adults in a room, needed to die. And I needed to accept that. And I needed to think more deeply about what that meant for me. So I spent the following few years writing about the rest of these women's lives, but then also completely owning and writing about my own death. And in that, it was the most powerful rebirth that I have ever had. It was like an exorcism. It was me separating myself from the person that never had any control, but was really good at what she did, and very masterful and very manipulative, but never looked at it and said, I am more than this. I am bigger than what this is. I can do more. I want to do more. I don't have to be this small. Even if I think this big, I don't have to stay this small. And the result of that was was the book that I wrote, Dark Sparkler, which was mentioned. And all in all, it was a 6-year journey. And recently at a show, a couple nights ago, I did a show in, last night. That'll tell you how long I've been doing shows. I did a show in Seattle last night, and I told an extremely abbreviated version of this story. And I read these poems, and I took questions from people in the audience. And the very last question I took, a little old woman in the front raised her hand, and I said, "Yeah, what would you like to ask?" And she just stared at me, and I just stared at her. And then I realized that the woman in the front her name was Sharon DeBoard. She was my first agent. She was the one that came to the play when I was in 4th grade and discovered me in Pippi Longstockings and got me into acting. And she burst into tears. And then I burst into tears in front of, 200 people. And we had an incredibly intimate conversation on a stage in which she said, "I'm sorry, I didn't know that this is what it was like for you. You were so powerful as a child and even now, and I never thought that it affected you in that way." And I got to say to her in front of all these people, "Please don't be sad, and please especially don't be sorry. Nothing wrong happened. If anything, you are the direct result of this book happening. And this book is not just about actresses, it's about women. And it's about the way women are treated and seen and viewed and loved and hated. And without that, and the girls that have come up to me and said how much this has profoundly changed them, without you seeing me with a coat hanger through my braids and thigh highs with stripes on them in a play at a public school in Santa Monica one day, this book would not exist, and I would not have affected these lives, and they would not have affected me." Afterwards, we hugged, and it was incredible. So I guess what I want to leave you with is saying, break all of the rules always, especially your own. Thank you.